And we'll go ahead and get started here in another, well, my clock just moved to 12, so maybe we'll go ahead and get started. Are you good with that, Gail?
Works for me.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on Raising Your Dairy Best Heifer webinar series. Again, this is our season 2, brought to you by the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. My name is Jennifer Bentley, and I work as a dairy field specialist housed in Northeast Iowa. So we're kind of in the middle of our webinar series here. We wrapped up a few in the last few weeks on Wednesdays, and we're going to continue here through December 3rd. Gail, so if you wouldn't mind moving the slide to the next one there, we'll just kind of give a rundown of next week. We're going to be coming back talking about fresh cow success. Starts with the heifer calving pen readiness, and that's going to be with Dr. Howard Tyler. And then our colleague, Dr. Larry Tranel, will be November 19th talking about pasture raised potential grazing dairy heifers. And then we'll conclude on December 3rd with Pamela Adkins from University of Missouri talking about heifer mastitis. So um, want to welcome Gail Carpenter to our webinar series here today. She's going to be talking about practical tips for managing heifer body condition scoring, or heifer body condition. Sorry, I always put score at the end of that all the time. So heifer body condition. And just a little introduction of Gail. She's been working with Iowa State since 2021 as an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Animal Science at Iowa State and has worked in various capacities in the dairy industry prior to joining Iowa State. Most recently, she was a dairy nutritionist for CSA Animal Nutrition in Ohio. And before that, she was assistant professor at the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus in the Department of Animal Biosciences. And so at Iowa State now, Dr. Carpenter teaches applied dairy farm evaluation, coaches the Dairy Challenge team, and works with dairy size students. She also holds statewide dairy extension appointments, working with our ISU Extension Dairy team on dairy educational programming and outreach. So thanks for joining us, Gail, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Jen, for that introduction. I'm excited to come talk to you guys today about this topic of body condition and how we manage body condition in heifers in particular. I've started quite a few of my talks about heifers with this slide or something similar. So if you've seen it before, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I do think it's an important thing to discuss. So we know that heifers are the foundation of the herd. They are your replacements. They are the animals that will be entering your milking string in the next couple of years. And so raising them right and doing right by them is really important for making sure your lactating cow herd is set up for success. However, even though they are the foundation of the herd, there are a few different things that we have to remember about heifers. They are, first of all, costly. Heifers are not cheap. About 25% of a dairy's production costs are going to be in raising heifer replacements. So they are not actually paying the bills right now, but they are costing a fair amount of money. So I think it's important when we're talking about heifers to make sure that we are getting a good return on investment for those animals. They're also a little bit of a black box. I think this is one of the challenging things as we've been working with producers talking about heifer development, especially post-weaning heifer development. One of the things that we think about a lot, or one of the challenges that we see often is that, you're pre-weaning calves, you're in there, you're feeding calves 2 or 3 times a day, or you have an auto feeder doing it, but you have a lot of even if the feeder's doing it, you have maintenance on that machine, and then you have all the data from that machine. If they're in the lactating string, we're obviously milking them 2 or 3 times a day, or that's automated as well. And so in that pre-weaning phase and then in the lactating phase, we have a lot of daily touch points with these animals. Heifers, especially our heifers between weaning and first calving, we do not have the same touch points. They might not even be on the same facility, right? They might be out on the back 40. They might be down at the old farm, around the corner. There's a lot of different heifers might not even be on the same site, even if you are raising your own heifers. And so they are a bit of a black box compared to some of the other animals in our herd. But again, they really are the future of the herd. Healthy, genetically advanced heifers that calve at the right maturity are the foundation for making sure we're setting our herd up for success. So here's what I want to talk to you guys today, specific to body condition and managing body condition in heifers. I want everybody to understand by the end of this talk that managing body condition in heifers sets you up for getting the most out of that investment, that 25% of production cost, making sure that body condition is an important aspect of that. Both overconditioning and underconditioning can set heifers up to fail, and I'll talk about a little bit of the research behind that. You've probably heard this before, but you can't manage what you don't measure. So making sure that we are actually paying attention to body condition is going to be an important part of managing body condition. And I'll talk about some tips for that as well. And then finally, once we kind of have a handle on what the body condition of our heifers actually is, it's important to set up feeding and management systems to keep these heifers on target. So let's talk a little bit about the problems with both overconditioning and underconditioning. So this is kind of a Goldilocks problem, right? Goldilocks and the three bears. Papa bear's too big, mama bear or baby bear's no, Papa bear's too whatever, too hot, mama bear's too cold, baby bear's just right, right? Like Papa bear's bed's too hard, mama bear's bed's too soft, baby bear's just right. We are looking for the baby bear in this situation. We don't want them too fat, we don't want them too thin. So we have some different risks, but we still have risks around both overconditioning and underconditioning. Both of those, depending on the severity of the over or underconditioning, can result in transition cow problems. Specifically, animals that lose a lot of body fat around calving are more likely to have transition problems. But if you're already underconditioned and don't have those energy reserves around calving, that can also cause issues as well. Overconditioning can have a negative impact on milk production and mammary development. And then there's also some evidence that it can impact reproductive performance as well. Underconditioning, we can have some lameness issues, as well as because of that hard transition, we can have some reduced first lactation performance. So high body condition, there is a little bit of controversy around this, but there is a good amount of evidence that high body condition score can impair that mammary development. So this is a paper published in Journal of Dairy Science about 20 years ago now. And I'll pull up my laser pointer real quick. That over here on our y-axis is labeled parenchymal DNA. And when we're measuring parenchymal DNA, that's just a fancy way of saying we want to look at how much actual udder tissue has been developed in the udder, right, versus a fat pad, for example. So looking at parenchymal DNA, and then these researchers they took data from a bunch of different studies that had been done at Michigan State and kind of compiled these different studies together. And so they looked at body weight gain as well as body fat. And so the more parenchymal DNA we have, the more udder development we've had. And if you look at it, there's actually, and this is per kilogram of body weight. So we've adjusted it to be based on the body weight of that animal. And as body weight increases, body weight gain increases, we don't see any impact on udder development there, right? Not in terms of udder development per unit of body weight. So obviously bigger heifers might have bigger udders, but per unit of body weight, the more we gain, the higher our average daily gain is. If we're just looking at pure body weight, there's not a strong relationship between body weight gain and udder development. However, if we take a look at body fat, which is what we're measuring when we measure body condition score, there is a negative relationship. So as that body fat percentage increases, we do see a decline in that parenchymal DNA per kilogram of body weight. So increased body, this is what the authors concluded in this paper, increased body fatness was a better predictor of impaired memory development than was rapid body weight gain. And they found that feeding heifers high energy diets to induce that body weight gain decreased mammary development. But if they just if they just set dietary treatment aside and just looked at animals who grew faster, growing fast in and of itself does not necessarily impede mammary development. So what we're looking at specifically is, are we feeding diets that increase body condition of those heifers? There is evidence based on this paper that that can have a negative impact on mammary development. And as we can probably say, poor mammary development will probably not result in good milk production. So there is good evidence that high body condition score can impair mammary development. Low body condition, this is a 2015 paper in Journal of Dairy Science. They looked at low body condition and the risk of lameness. So they did some fancy modeling here to come up with these predictions. And if they looked at moderately lame cows and severely lame cows, you can see here the solid line here on top. Those are the animals with the body condition score less than 2. So we can see both with moderately lame and severely lame animals, if they had a very low body condition score, a body condition score less than 2, that was associated with increased risk of lameness. However, we do also see that body condition score of 2 is problematic as well. And some of these lower body conditions greater than 2, but still probably not high enough. Those body conditions did seem to also increase that risk of lameness. And so these authors concluded that a body condition score of at least 2.5 is optimal for hoof health. And so that should be our floor. Not to say that 2.5 is optimal, but at least a body condition score of 2.5 is optimal for hoof health. And then I want to also point out that we don't just want to watch the average on this, right? We don't want to just make sure that our heifers are averaging a 325 or whatever we're targeting. We want to make sure that we don't have a lot of variation. And so I have here a picture of 3 different curves, and you can see all of these have the same mean, but some of these are a lot more spread out than others. And so if we have a curve where we have a lot of heifers that are over-conditioned and a lot of heifers that are under-conditioned, or if we see a lot of variation when we're walking around farm where we see over-fat and over-thin cows, we're going to have the worst of all times, because we're going to have all the problems associated with high body condition, as well as all the problems associated with low body condition. And so making sure that we're hitting somewhere in the middle, that most of our animals are somewhere in the middle, not that we'll never have any fat cows or we'll never have cows that are too thin, making sure the majority of our animals are within that range is just as important as making sure we get that average rate. So what should we target? This is based on Dairy Calf and Heifer Association guidelines. And they recommend, and I've talked about in other talks before, making sure that we're breeding heifers at 55% of mature body size. Body weight is something that we do measure, but also, or we can measure, but frame size is another important part of that too. And frame size might on some farms be an easier metric than body weight. And the way you do that is basically by looking at how tall a cow is or how tall a heifer is. So you might see a line on the wall, right? Or you might know how high your headlocks are and when heifers have when their withers or their hip, whatever you've decided, when they've reached a certain height, you know those animals are big enough to breed. So I specifically put mature body size here, not just body weight, because we want to consider both weight and frame size. And mature body weight, because that's a term I'm going to use a couple more times throughout this presentation. Mature body weight is going to be animals in your 3rd and 4th lactation. So cows who have reached their mature body size, but not older, right? Not that 5th, 6th, 7th lactation. They're going to be animals in mid lactation. So not early or late lactation when we know we might have cows that are a little thin or a little over conditioned. And then we don't want to use cows who have been culled or are on the cull list, right? Those cows tend to not be the healthiest cows in our herd. So a good representation of mature body size would be an average of cows in their 3rd or 4th lactation, in mid lactation, that don't have a lot of problems that would result in culling. And so that's our target for body size. For body condition, which is what this specific presentation is about, we want to be targeting that body condition score of 325 to 35 at first calving. And this is based on the most recent recommendations, like I said, of the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association. So the 2024 was when it was last updated. We have seen that in mature cows, for example, that body condition score of 3 tends to be what we're targeting, because again, we don't want to see cows that drop a lot of body condition in early lactation. The recommendation used to be, okay, they're gonna get a little bit more conditioned in late lactation, but then they milk it off in early lactation, they'll drop in body condition a bit. And so you used to see those recommendations for lactating cows that would assume that there was going to be some fluctuation in body condition. Understanding now that we don't want to see major fluctuations in body condition. And so if we have a lactating cow who's a 3 all the way through, that's going to be more ideal. For heifers, there has not been as much data on that for our primiparous cows. And so personally, based on the direction that we're going with the lactating cows, and knowing that we don't want them to drop a lot in body weight after calving, personally, I would prefer to see heifers a little bit more on the less conditioned end of that. So I'd prefer to see heifers that are more in that 3-2 range versus that 3-5 range. Younger heifers, especially, the 12-month-old heifers, the ones that are breeding age, maybe a little bit closer to 3. And then at first calving, making sure certainly no heavier than that 3-5. So those are the targets that we're shooting for. But you can't manage what you don't measure. Again, I'm sure you've heard that. I'm sure you've heard that many times before. That whatever it is, whether that's dry matter on your corn silage or milk production or whatever else, if you're not actually taking a measure of it, you have no way to manage it. And I've heard producers say before, especially with body condition, oh, I just don't know how to, I don't know how to do that. And it's something that takes a little bit of practice. But I'm hoping to kind of in the next couple slides simplify it for you and kind of point out some landmarks on that cow's physiology that we can use to quickly and easily body condition score cows. So the first thing we want to look at is the side view of the cow. And by looking at that side view, that's how we're quickly going to be able to differentiate if an animal is at least a 3 or if she's over 3. And so if we take a look at the side view here, if we see, and for those who have done dairy judging, I'm going to remind you of your cow parts. So this is the pin. I believe the ischium is the scientific term for that hip part of that bone of the pelvis. But the pin bone back here, right on either side of the tail head. The thurl is this joint right here that you can see. That's where the leg actually attaches to the body wall. And then the hip or the hook is going to be this bigger bone at the front of the pelvis. I think that's the ilium, if I remember my anatomy and physiology correctly. So if we take a look at hips to thurl to pin, if that's more of a V shape or more of a U shape, that helps us know, are we above or below that body condition score of 3? And so if it's a V right there, that's going to be body condition score of 3 or less, versus if we have a U shape, those animals are going to be over a body condition score of 3. And generally speaking, when I'm thinking about heifers, I'm focusing more, based on most farms I've been on, over conditioning, maybe a little bit more of a problem in a lot of heifers than under conditioning. And so I want to talk a little bit about that over conditioning side in a little bit more detail. But right here, that's a really good first check. Are we over 3 or under 3? So this cow here in the first picture, she's going to be a body condition score of 275. She's just under a body condition score of 3. And then this cow in the second picture is a body condition score of 325. So she's just over. So side view, we look at that hip to thurl to pin angle and decide, okay, are we at or below a 3 or are we above a 3? Once we start looking above a 3, so remember we're shooting for like this 325 probably on our heifers, no heavier than this 3.5, certainly not greater than a 4. After we've looked at that side view on our animals, we switch and we start looking at the rear view. And what you're looking at in the rear view, specifically when we're talking about cows that are over a 3, I want you to look at the sacral ligaments and the tailhead ligaments, which I've labeled here for you so you don't have to remember. The sacral ligament is basically that ligament that attaches the hip bones. And then the tailhead is obviously going to be the pin bones right on either side of the tailhead. If you can see both ligaments, and we've got that U shape on the side, so we know we're above a 3. But you take a look and you can see both of the ligaments, and it might be a little hard to see, and the pictures are not ideal. But you can't give webinars in the barn, unfortunately. Um, so we're stuck with pictures. But in this first picture, we can see both the sacral and the tail head ligament on this cow. And so the this cow is a 325. If you can see, uh, you're starting to see the that should be tail head ligament. You can still see the tail head ligament there, but the sacral ligament is a little less visible. We're looking at this at a 3-5. If you've lost all if you've lost all sight of the either of those ligaments, that cow is a 4 or higher. And so this cow in the first picture here is a 325. This cow in the second picture, you see we're kind of losing sight of both of these ligaments. This cow is a 4. And so if you're losing sight of both of those ligaments, we know that cow is over conditioned. And from the side view, you're not going to see either angle a lot of times. From the side view, you're not going to see a V or a U, you're going to see a kind of flat tabletop. If you're seeing a lot of flat angles from hips to thurls to pins, you're not seeing a clear differentiation on that thurl joint. We know those animals are overconditioned. Those animals are a 4 or higher. Now, how do you now that I've explained that a little bit, and there's some really great resources. Elanco, I encourage you just to Google Elanco body condition score sheet. They have a really great resource that breaks it down into like a decision tree, and it makes it really easy to kind of walk through and pay attention. When you're going under a body condition score of 3, sometimes it helps to actually feel, like palpate the hips and pins and feel how much of a fat pad you have. It's a really great resource that'll walk you through it. So those are some key landmarks to pay attention to that I just walked through, but there's, it's kind of fun to walk through that whole thing. So next time you're walking a farm, I encourage you to kind of start practicing a little bit, right? Like pay attention to the landmarks that you're looking at, and notice what you see on those landmarks, and kind of start practicing a little. So that method, it's the Penn State method, but Elanco's really done a good job of making that an accessible and easy to understand resource. That method is the one I prefer for teaching body condition scoring. And the reason for that is they've actually demonstrated that there is a lot less inter-observer error when you teach it with that method versus when you just show. You've probably seen like this is a picture of a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5. If you can actually walk through that decision tree, it reduces that error or the disagreement between two observers. So if Jen and I are both walking together and we're both using that Penn State method, we'll be a lot closer than if we weren't using that. That doesn't mean, though, that we agree on every single thing, especially those cows who are a little bit borderline. Maybe she's a 3-5, maybe she's a 3-7-5, somewhere in between. Jen and I might disagree on that, but we're not going to walk through and say one's a 3 and one's a 3-5 if we're using that method. So that is the method that I prefer when I'm teaching body condition scoring to my students. And it's the one that I prefer when we're measuring body condition score for research purposes. And when I do it for research purposes, we do also have at least 2 independent observers walk through separately, assign body condition score, and then take the average. Because there is going to be a little bit of disagreement. So you want to make sure that you're having a couple people if you're going to publish this paper in Journal of Dairy Science, you want to be pretty careful about how you do that. If you, as a producer or a consultant or some member of the dairy industry, are just trying to get better at body condition scoring, don't stress out over if a cow is a 3 or a 3-2-5, right? It's that doesn't make a huge difference. If you can't tell the difference, it's probably borderline, and it's probably not worth stressing over. If you're concerned about whether she's a heifer's a 2-2-5 or a 2-5, that probably doesn't make a big difference either because we know she's too thin, right? If you're not sure if she's a 3-7-5 or a 4, that doesn't make a difference either because she's too fat. So it's a good place to start while you're learning and kind of practicing. But ultimately, hopefully you're getting to a point where you're just like thin cow, fat cow, good cow. That Goldilocks, the mama bear, papa bear, baby bear. So that's the first thing I want you guys to think about while you are thinking about body condition scoring is just practice, pay attention. And actually, I put it second on the list though, even though I said it's the first thing. Just be mindful. Like as you're walking barns, try to pay attention to stuff like that. Especially if you're a producer or somebody who visits the same farm or farms frequently, it can be really easy to get barn blind to what's going on. So just make a habit of as you're walking heifer pens, as you're walking cow pens, make a habit of actually paying attention to that. My other piece of advice when it comes to monitoring is try to habit stack. That's maybe a little bit trendy term. Um, but habit stacking is basically trying to attach a new habit to an existing habit that you already have. So if you can start paying attention to body condition while you're breeding, if you can start paying attention to body condition while you're doing dry offs, while you're doing pen moves, like as you're already doing other things with those heifers, try to tack body condition on with it. So one of the things I recommend a lot if dairy producers or consultants are trying to add new habits is don't do it on its own, right? Don't go out and say, I'm going to start, walking pens once a month and monitoring body condition score. You will probably not keep up with it, right? But if you are saying, I'm going to start paying attention to body condition while I'm moving pens, while I'm sorting heifers, while I'm breeding heifers, is something you're a lot more likely to pay attention to. So start paying attention, start practicing. Make sure you're practicing while you're doing other things. The other tip that I have is to bring in fresh eyes. If you're a dairy producer who's watching this or listening to me talking about this, feel free to ask your nutritionist. Feel free to contact your local dairy extension specialist. Bring in somebody, your veterinarian, whoever it is. Bring in somebody who's going to have a fresh perspective on the condition of the heifers in your herd. Because if you're working with those heifers routinely, you might not notice those shifts as much as somebody who's coming in once a month or so. So make sure that you take advantage of those fresh eyes. I coach our dairy challenge team here at Iowa State. So that's one of the things that I think is either on practice farms or on our contest herds. I know that producers get a lot of value out of people walking through and just students being like, hey, this is something that I've noticed. This is something that it's really easy, again, to get barn blind to. And oh, yeah, my peppers are a little heavy, right? But it's something that always is falling its way down on the priority list of things we need to attack or address. And so having somebody fresh come in and say, hey, like this is actually something you might want to prioritize might be the nudge that you need to actually start talking to your nutritionist about this a little bit more. So don't be afraid to bring in somebody with that fresh perspective. And then I put down here at the bottom, consider recording. And my main thing I want to talk about when I'm talking about record keeping on this is we want to make this as easy as possible. We want to be able to hit the easy button on these things, right? And not make it a whole new procedure that we do on a routine basis, because if you try to add a whole other thing, it's going to be a lot harder to keep up with, right? There's so many other things that are going on a dairy farm on a day-to-day basis. Adding a whole other thing, in this case, body condition scoring, if it makes it hard enough that you never do it, it's worse than doing something simple and easy, right? So not everybody, actually, I would argue probably most people are not recording body condition scores. They're probably not actively scoring and writing that down somewhere, whether that's in their herd monitoring software or notebook or whatever. Most people probably are not doing that. If it is something that you think you see value in and you think you can do along with some of your other things, you can consider doing that, certainly. I think there's a lot of nutritionists and veterinarians out there that would love to have their hands on that information if that's something that you do want to write down. But don't watch this talk and hear me talk about body condition score and decide it's important Decide you're going to do this walk every pen once a month and write it down and record it in dairy comp and then have that to look through. And then after 3 months of doing it, decide it's not worth your time and stop doing it altogether. Um, so if recording is something you can do and add to some of your other tasks easily, it's worth thinking about. But don't let that be a deal breaker in actually managing and paying attention to body condition. All right, now that we've talked about why we want a body condition score, we talked about how to body condition score. Let's talk about if your heifers are not on target, if they're over conditioned or under conditioned, how can we set up our feeding and management systems to make sure that we're either keeping or bringing our heifers back to that target? And I always, the farm is a system, right? We can't think about any of these things that I have listed here in a vacuum. All of these things tie in together. And they tie in together with a lot of other things on the farm as well. But I want to focus on nutrition, management, and facilities. And we'll start with focusing a little bit on nutrition. So some key points I want to talk about when it comes to heifer nutrition is that mature body weight is a critical metric for proper heifer nutrition and growth. I already talked a little bit about what mature body weight is. And I talked about how it's important to set targets. So for example, we want heifers to calve in at 85% of mature body weight after their first calving. We want to breed them at 55% of their mature body weight. But it's more than just a way to set targets. It's actually really important to our ration modeling systems, the software that your rations are balanced on. It is critical for those models that we have our mature body weight at least somewhat close. And that's because body condition changes as heifers approach maturity, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail on the next slide. We also want to make sure that we're managing and monitoring heifer body condition while optimizing growth, right? So we want heifers to grow. But like we talked about, we don't want them to be growing in body weight and only putting on fat, not putting on frame size. So we can manage heifer body condition. If we have over-conditioned heifers, we can strategically manage our forage inventory. And I'll talk about some strategies here in a sec, some general strategies. Alternative forages. I usually throw in a plug for using some of these alternative forages. When I was at the University of Guelph, we did some work with switchgrass hay, for example. It's crappy. It does not actually have any nutritive value to it. But those crappy hays without a lot of nutritive value can be really useful when it comes to making sure that our heifers feel full and satiated without trying to pack on a lot of extra calories and body fat. So body composition changes as animals approach maturity. So in this example right here, I have two animals. One animal is an 1,800-pound mature body weight, and the other animal is going to be a 1,400-pound mature body weight. This slide was adapted from a webinar that Mike Van Amberg did in 2016 for the nutritionists, which is the AMTS. You can go find it on the AMTS website. I highly recommend it if you're interested in heifer nutrition. These next two slides are kind of adapted from that webinar. And that was a webinar that really made a lot of things click with me when it came to heifer nutrition. But here we have two heifers. One of them is an 1,800-pound mature body weight. The other's 1,400 pounds. As you get closer to maturity, it becomes, some of us know this from personal experience, as you get closer to maturity, it becomes easier to put on fat and harder to put on protein. So as you get closer to that final body weight that you will achieve in life, it becomes easier to put on additional fat as you're putting on body weight. And so if we consider this body composition here, this x-axis, that's going to be basically a fat to protein ratio. So as our body weight increases, we are going to have more fat deposition as we get close to that mature body size. So we can have two animals here that are this, again, if we consider the 1,800-pound cow and the heifer that will be 1,800 pounds and the heifer that will be 1,400 pounds, these two at the same body weight, they are going to have different body composition, right? So this 1,800-pound heifer, or this heifer that will be 1,800 pounds, she is going to be earlier at the same body weight. She is going to be earlier in her development. And so she's not going to be putting on as much fat as readily as the heifer whose ultimate body weight is only going to be 1,400 pounds. So at the same body weight, the animal that will be smaller when she matures is closer to her mature body size. So she will have an easier time putting on fat. And then if we look at two heifers that are having this have a similar body composition, similar fat to protein ratio, depending on what their mature body size is, they're going to have different body weights. Okay. And so that actually impacts how the predictions of the CNCPS model. So CNCPS, Cornell, uh, uh, net, Cornell Net Carbohydrate and Protein System. N doesn't stand for net. I don't remember what N stands for off the top of my head. Sorry, I'm panicking a little. That the CNCPS is going to be the ration balancing, the model that our main ration balancing softwares are focused on, specifically NDS and AMTS and some others as well. And so we can see here, two animals on the same diet. If we balance our energy and protein allowable gain for this 1,400-pound heifer, and this heifer with the 1,400-pound mature body weight, the animal with the higher mature body weight, if we feed that same diet to her, she's going to have a lot more energy allowable gain than protein allowable gain, which means she is going to probably start gaining more fat on this diet than she would be otherwise. And potentially as animals get older and closer to that mature body size, this effect tends to compound. So actually having a good understanding of what your mature body weight in your herd is a really good first step when it comes to managing body condition in these animals. If we're looking at options for balancing growth and body condition score, we could do a whole webinar just on the concepts that I'm talking about in this slide right here. But I'm just going to briefly mention it. So we have this idea of limit feeding, or a more politically correct term right now might be precision feeding. If we're precision feeding animals, we're going to feed them potentially a higher grain diet, but we're going to feed them under their ad libitum intake, or feed them under what they would normally be eating if we just let them go on their own. If we have cheap commodity and cheap grain prices, precision feeding animals with a higher grain diet might be a good tool. However, if heifers are at all overstocked, or if they don't have equal feed access, if not all heifers are comfortable and capable of getting to the feed bunk at the same time, precision feeding is a very bad idea. Because if you have a higher energy density diet and not all heifers can get up to the bunk or will get up to the bunk at the same time, what you're going to have is a bunch of boss heifers eating ad libitum intake, eating as much as they want, overeating what we've predicted they need, and then there's not enough left for those shyer heifers. And so you're going to see that variation in body condition. You're going to see that worst of both worlds. So that's one strategy. It's a very good strategy. There's a lot of evidence behind it, but it does not work if you have heifers that are overstocked and don't have equal feed access. The other strategy that we see for balancing body condition is feeding a lower energy density diet, similar to like a dry cow diet. If we feed more bulk, more of those lower nutrient forages, but we let them eat whatever they want, they're satiated, they're satisfied, they're full, but they're not overeating energy. So if we have lower quality forages, if we have a lot of inventory of lower quality forages, especially for older heifers with a developed rumen, this can be a good option for them. But if we're limited on forage availability, this strategy might not work. So there's some general strategies around nutrition. Let's talk a little bit about management. And I will tell you, for management and facilities specifically, I'm probably going to be talking about things that you're going to listen to and be like, well, duh, I already knew that. But I do think a lot of these like back to basics reminders are really important, because frankly, a lot of issues that we see are just the basics have slipped a little bit, right? And so we might not be achieving our optimum because we need to be reminded of some of those basics. So again, if you're working with these animals day in and day out, some things might slip without us really noticing. So let's talk a little bit about management. This should be pretty obvious, but if we want to measure heifer body condition, we want to get them pregnant. And this is a great strategy when it comes to monitoring body condition score on lactating cows too. Get them pregnant when they need to be pregnant. If they are lactating for longer than they should be, if they're later days in milk when they should be, or if they are developing and growing too much before they calve in because they haven't gotten bred when they need to get bred, they are more likely to be gaining in body condition. This goes back to that idea of the high fertility cycle. This is not a reproduction talk, but if you've heard of the high fertility cycle, um, if you have less body condition gain, there's less body condition loss. That body condition loss is associated with health issues. And so if we have less of that body condition loss, we have fewer health issues that improves the fertility of the animal, which means they will get pregnant earlier, get pregnant on schedule, which means they will not gain as much body condition, which means they will not lose as much body condition, right? And it's something that's a positive feedback loop that we really want to see. Usually when we're talking about the high fertility cycle, um, we're talking about lactating cows, but the same concept applies to heifers as well, right? It starts as a heifer, I should say. If they are not getting bred as quickly as they should be or getting pregnant as quickly as they should be before their first calving, they're probably going to calve in at a higher body condition that we want, which will set them off on the wrong foot for this high fertility cycle. So looking a little bit, and this is again from the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association Gold Standards, looking at pregnant heifer management, a couple main things to think about. We want to be preg checking at 35 to 45 days post-breeding and quickly get those animals back on a breeding program. I'm not going to talk a lot about synchronization or resynchronization protocols because frankly, that is over my head. But getting them back onto a rebreeding program is going to be an excellent first step with with getting heifers pregnant. And then making sure that we're reconfirming pregnancies before 200 days in calf in case we've slipped that calf and have an animal that is no longer pregnant that is in our bred heifer pen. Some other things to think about when we're thinking about getting them pregnant. The first thing, I hope this doesn't surprise anybody, but to get a heifer pregnant, first you have to breed them. And it sounds very dumb when I say it that way, but it's really crucial when it comes to age at first calving, heifer pregnancy rate, and getting heifers pregnant. So, like I said, we want to breed them at that correct maturity and body size, but we don't want to. And so you might see a little bit of variation in age at first breeding because we might hold back some heifers that aren't big enough, right? So body size might be something that we consider. But in this, it's hard to see. I apologize. In this graph, this is an age at first breeding graph, and we see that some heifers are bred as young as 380 days in this example, and some heifers have been bred as late as 570 days on their first breeding. And so we're seeing a 200-day variation in first breeding in this particular example right here. And so I don't think that has to do with not getting heifers at the correct body size. I think that has to do with dairy farmers are incredibly busy and there's an ever-growing to-do list of things on a dairy farm. And it can be very easy to let the heifers slide. So again, going back to make this as easy for yourself to do as possible. So invest in heat detection and conception rate improvements in heifers. So this can be looking at a heat sink, see sink, whatever synchronization protocol you think you can stick to. Work with your veterinarian to find something that works for your farm. Maybe investing in activity monitoring systems. Maybe that's something that can work really well for your facility within the facility constraints that you have and the budgetary constraints that you have. Activity monitoring and helping find heifers that are in a natural heat can be a good thing to consider. Honestly, sometimes this might just be we are going to start actually sticking to the protocol that we have written, right? If we say we're going to check heats on heifers twice a day, but really we only do it every other day because we have other stuff going on, maybe it's time to think about, all right, this is the protocol we have written. Let's stick with that protocol and see if we can see some improvements in actually getting semen into those heifers. And then that could even be as simple as, well, we're going to try checking visual heats more. We're visually checking heifers, but we're going to go out and make sure that we're doing it more frequently. Make it easy on yourself to do, as easy as you can. But let's try and see, but getting that window in first breeding tightened up will go really far when it comes to tightening up our age at first calving. And then finally, there's feed management as well. I put this under management, not nutrition, but it does come back to feed management. Again, a lot of things that we can think about when it comes to feed management. So making sure that we're reducing sorting, getting that head state particle separator, if we're shaking out diets, making sure that the diet that we've shaken out after feeding and before feeding is pretty close, right? That means if it's pretty close, that means we don't have a lot of sorting. If it's not, if we see a lot of variation or we see a lot of evidence of sorting, let's think about how we can reduce that sorting behavior in heifers. Again, if we have a lot of sorting, we're going to have some heifers over consuming energy and some heifers under consuming energy. And we're going to see that variation. And we don't want that variation. That's the worst of both worlds. And so some things we can do to think about equal feed access, but also reducing sorting. And I will say, if you are precision feeding heifers, several of the things on this list are especially important, right? If you're precision feeding heifers and the feed gets pushed back away from the feed bunk and heifers can't reach it throughout the day, making sure it's pushed up throughout the day is going to be especially important. Maybe this means we have to feed more frequently, especially in the summertime. So if you're feeding your heifers every other day in the summer, maybe we need to think about feeding it once a day. Pushing up feed more often. If your heifers are out, again, if they're out on the back 40 or they're at the old farm, they're wherever they are, we might see that you're less likely to push that feed up. But what can you do to make it easier to push up feed so that you're more likely to push up feed? Is that setting a reminder on your phone? Is it making sure if you're using a hand scoop, making sure that hand scoop's somewhere easy to grab when you walk by? Whatever it is, how can we make it easier for us to push up feed more often? Stocking density, managing stocking density is going to be incredibly important here, especially again, if you're limit feeding animals. Making sure that we have equal access to the bunk. If we have broken headlocks and heifers can't stick their head through all the headlocks, doesn't matter if the headlock's there and technically we have the right number of headlocks if they're not all usable, right? So making sure we have equal availability to the feed bunk. Reducing the particle size of our larn forages, considering using some sort of liquid, maybe molasses or water, if we have dry feeds to hold those feed together, make sure that we don't have a lot of sorting, and then removing refusals when we can. So the last thing I want to talk about as we talk about this whole system is facilities. And I'm going to be talking in very broad terms because every facility is so different, because this is not a facilities talk. So just again, some back to basics and some simple things to think about. So you design your heifer facilities and think about how you can make your heifer facilities work with you, not against you. So proper housing is important for keeping heifers on the right foot or right hoof. Some things to keep in mind when we're thinking about heifer facilities: cost, efficiency of labor, and heifer performance. Grouping heifers, grouping them by age and or size, making sure we don't have a lot of size disparity within a group, right? You don't want a lot of very big heifers and a lot of very small heifers together, especially if we are overstocked or don't have good feed bunk access. And then as they get older, you can increase the size of those groups as well. It says increase age as they get older. That should be group size. Obviously, they're going to increase in age as they get older. Some environmental conditions to think about are temperature and ventilation, where they have resting surfaces, what feeding space they have, how much water is available, and how we're handling manure. If you want more about facilities, specifically pre-weaning facilities, I will put in a plug. We're recording this in early November 2022, or no, it's not 2022. It hasn't been 2022 in 3 years. We're recording this in early November 2025. And we do have coming up here in a couple of weeks, we have in our professional development for Iowa dairy professionals at our Iowa State Dairy Farm, we'll have a calf ventilation workshop. We will be fogging a barn, talking about ventilation with one of our engineers. And then we're also going to do a demonstration of lung ultrasounds and talk about how ventilation and lung ultrasounds our respiratory health go together. So if facilities are something you're interested in and you feel dissatisfied by how much detail I went into onto the slide, you should sign up to join us for that event on November 21st. There we go. All right, the other thing I want to talk about when it comes to management is avoiding overstocking. Overstocking heifers results in unequal feed access, like I've mentioned. It might cause heifers to be reaching for feed. Um, every time heifers reach for feed, especially on concrete flooring, and they're pushing, you might have foot health issues and some corkscrew hoof issues. So we want to reduce how much time heifers spend reaching for feed. If we're thinking about overstocking, I want to think about, are we specifically looking at an issue with facilities? Like our facilities are not right sized for our replacement numbers? Or do we have an issue with our inventory? Or is it some combination of the two? So considering how you manage your heifer inventory is a really important first step when it comes to managing your stocking density on your heifers. I want to be sure that we're growing enough heifers in a herd, but I also want to be sure that we're doing a good job of growing them. So we want to make sure that we're breeding the correct number of heifers. And we want to make sure that every heifer that hits the ground on our dairy is set up so that she enters the herd as a healthy 2-year-old, whether that's managing body condition like we're talking about right now, whether that's respiratory health, facilities, breeding, all the breeding protocols we talked about earlier, making sure that we maximize the number of heifers that hit the ground on our farm that enter the herd as healthy 2-year-olds. Uh, we want to make sure when you're looking at inventory projections and the number of heifers you need to produce, one of the things we really need to think about is what our heifer non-complete rate is. So this can be a positive feedback loop and a bad thing. If our facilities are not right sized for the number of heifers that we need, and we're overstocking heifers, we might run into some health issues that increase the morbidity, how many heifers die or are sold from our farm or are not successfully bred or have other problems. In which case, we will have a higher heifer non-completion rate, which means that we will need a higher heifer inventory, right? So these two things can go together in kind of a bad way. And so sometimes reducing our stocking density, thinking about if we can reduce the number of heifers we produce, if that improves our heifer non-completion rate so that a higher proportion of the heifers that are born on our farm enter the herd, that might be the solution, depending on what you're dealing with your facilities and depends on a lot of things. Are you growing your herd, for example? And so it's a complicated question. Again, that in and of itself could be its own talk as well. But we want to make sure that we get that morbidity and mortality under control. All right, I'm here getting close to the top of the hour, so I want to just do some take-home suggestions and things to think about with items for action. So tomorrow, what do you want to start doing tomorrow if you've watched this webinar? The first thing I want you to do is start really looking at your heifers, right? Think about the landmarks that we talked about with body condition. Print off, if you want to, that body condition scoring sheet. Practice. Start looking. Start paying attention. Be mindful as you're walking through your heifer pens. Tomorrow, or even tonight, whenever you're watching this, go out and start actually paying attention to your heifers. Talk to your nutritionist, your veterinarian. Talk to somebody, your extension specialist. Talk to your local dairy challenge coach. Talk to somebody and ask if we can get another set of eyes on the farm to kind of take a look and see if there's something that you're missing. And then consider, what are my heifer breeding protocols, and am I following them? And are they actually achieving my goals for heifer pregnancy? So I want you to start doing these 3 things tomorrow. Within the next couple months, next month or two, I want you to talk to your nutritionist about how your nutrition program influences the growth, body condition, and age at first calving of your heifers. I want you to, if you decide that your heifer breeding protocols are not achieving your goals, I want you to think about, what are the bottlenecks that I have for reproduction? Why are we not getting what we need to out of my reproduction protocols? And then also evaluate, am I creating housing and facility issues for myself? And then evaluate heifer inventory. Is this something where less is more? Or is it something where we need to be thinking about an investment in new heifer facilities? Can I use the facilities that I have to be able to spread my heifers out a little bit more? But actually sit and evaluate your heifer inventory, whether that be with your semen company, your veterinarian, your nutritionist, whoever it is, take advantage of those people that are in your that you pay, or in the case of your extension specialist that you don't pay, except you do pay us through your tax dollars, right? So take advantage of those investments that you've made for the specialists that you work with that are in your circle, and feel free to bring those people in on the discussions. So with that, it looks like we're 5 minutes from the top of the hour. I hope we have a couple of minutes for questions here. I think it looks like we have a small group, so hopefully Jen doesn't mind if we just kind of do shouting out questions, or don't shout, like speak in a normal tone of voice. I can hear you. Um, and my email address is there on the screen right now. Happy to converse with anybody over email as well. So thank
Great.
you, Jen.
Thanks. Thanks, Gail. I appreciate that. Like Gail said, if you want to unmute and ask your question, or if you want to put it in the chat, you can. A few items as we're waiting for some of those to come in. I did put in the Lanco Body Condition Score PDF in the chat if anybody wants to download that. I also put in the webinar evaluation for today. So before you log off, if you wouldn't mind clicking on that and taking a short evaluation of today's program, that's helpful to our extension work. And also I put in the, Gail referred to the professional development for Iowa Dairy Industry Consultants, our industry doubleheaders. So if you want to learn more about what we're doing that day and want to participate, you're more than welcome to. We should say it's not just open to Iowa, it's Midwest or whoever
Yes.
wants to participate, right? We're just housing it in Iowa, but we're welcome to other states coming.
But if you don't want to just come down for a half day on Friday, stick around. We are doing a tailgate on Saturday. So we will be watching, or we'll be tailgating as Iowa State prepares to play Kansas, the University of Kansas. So I guess we're still recording, so I don't know if I should make any comments about what our football team's doing right now, but it's not as great as I thought it would be at the
Yep.
beginning of the season, that's for sure.
And then for those that may be asking, I did put in the chat the archived YouTube channel for all of the recordings of this webinar series, season 2. So if you have missed a few or want to go back and review them, they're all going to be hosted there on that YouTube channel. So feel free to check them out there. I'm going to just pause here and see if there's any questions coming through, if anybody unmutes. Otherwise, I have a few questions.
I guess that means I answered all of them, except
Yes.
for whichever ones you have, Jen.
Okay. Well, I just had just a couple questions on one, body condition score and breed. Does it, like, I think you're referring to mostly Holstein, and do those numbers change with, like, I'm thinking of jerseys because their
Hmm.
body size is going to be smaller than a Holstein's mature body weight, right? So how does that affect how we evaluate those?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know if I've seen a lot of really good research comparing. And I think Jersey people get really annoyed if you assume that jerseys are just small Holsteins. So I don't want to say that you should do that, but I do think that when it comes to body condition, the as of right now, based on the research that we have, the recommendations are fairly similar. Obviously, if you're looking at body size at breeding or at calving, it's still the percentage of mature body weight, right? So, or mature body size. So, because they have a smaller mature body size, they're going to have smaller targets. They also tend to, because they mature lighter, because they are smaller, they will tend to also probably mature earlier in some cases as well. So it's not as uncommon to see a younger age at first calving in jerseys as it would be in Holsteins. But when it comes to body condition, not really a lot of evidence for breed differences.
I would change that question and ask, what about a crossbred dairy population? That's kind of the growing thing we're seeing in a lot of regions. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, and there's even less data when it comes to crossbreds too, because so many, it is very true that that's one of our fastest growing populations of dairy cattle. But just like I don't want to say a Jersey is a small Holstein, I don't want to say a Hojo is the same as a Procross, right? And so I'm sure that like the Procross organization probably has some data on that. But I have not seen a lot of published data when it comes to recommendations. Generally speaking, I'd kind of go back to, again, that mature body size, percent of mature body size. The other thing that can make that challenging with crossbred herds, especially if you've been doing a three-way cross or changing your crosses around, you might have a lot of different sizes, right? Which can make it tricky to look at that mature body size. Um, but getting as good of an estimate as you can on percent of mature body size. And then the other thing would be we don't want to see a lot of animals that lose a lot of body condition after calving. So if they are at, if they're calving in at a 325, but they're staying at a 325, right? They're not dropping a lot in body condition. Maybe it's okay if they're a little bit more over conditioned as a crossbred herd, right? And so because there's so much variation, it's hard to do one solid recommendation. But what I'd say is don't drop, think about that percent of mature body size. Don't drop a lot of condition after calving. We don't want to see weight cycling. So that was a big, it depends.
Thanks, Gail. And I'm not seeing any other questions yet, so I'm going to ask my second one. Um, so this used to be something that I saw quite common, and maybe it's not as common as it used to be, but feeding our dairy heifers milk cow refusal. And how does that play into maybe overfeeding our heifers, over conditioning them? And do you have any tips for like balancing that? Because, we don't want to necessarily throw that feed away, but
Right.
we don't want to over
Yes.
condition our heifers too.
Yes. So that's a really great question, Jen. And you're exactly right that that does play into heifer body condition because if, especially, I mean, it depends on what's left over in the refusals, right? If you're feeding for a relatively high amount of refusals and it's not just sticks, right? If your refusals are like the sticks that are left over at the end of the day from the lactating cows, then probably that's not very high in energy density. But if you're feeding like a 3% refusal rate or whatever, and there is still a fair amount of, grains and corn silage and energy left in those refusals, feeding too much of that to your heifers can result in some conditioning issues. So the first place I'd go is actually take a step back and say, how can we reduce how many refusals we have in the first place, right? And you want to be careful about that. So you don't want to say, oh, we're going to feed to a slick bunk, and then just say you're going to feed to a slick bunk and not monitor that either, right? So if you say I want to come in at 4 o'clock in the morning to a slick bunk, that can be fine as long as the bunk is not slick until 3:30 in the morning, right? But if the bunk is actually slick at 10 o'clock at night and they're going 6 hours without feed, you can cause your issues with some lactating cows there as well. So making sure that we're still managing our feed in our lactating cows is a good place to start, and thinking about, are there ways that, like, if we have a lot of refusals every day that go to these heifers, like how can we reduce the amount of refusals that we have in the first place? And then we also want to be careful, especially in the summertime, with overheating in the bunk. So those refusals, especially again if there's a lot of them and if it's wet, they might be hot or starting to spoil by the end of the next day. And so that's probably something we might not necessarily want to feed a lot of that to our heifers. So thinking of, it's another reason why maybe you won't want a ton of refusals in the first place. But you can also dilution's the solution in a lot of cases, right? So making sure that we are putting some of those lower quality forages in to dilute some of those refusals, so it's not just like basically what we gave the lactating cows. The thing to be careful of with that, of course, is that if you're putting in these lower quality forages, whether that's straw or crappy hay, whatever it is, they have really long particle sizes, so just pick around that, right? So we want to shorten the particle size on those, making sure that we are keeping that somewhat keeping that so that we're avoiding sorting, even though we're feeding some of those. Don't just think about sorting in the lactating cow diet. Think about it in the heifer cow diet as well.
All right, thanks, Gail. Fred, are you seeing any questions or have any final thoughts or comments?
Nope, I'd say we covered, or Gail covered a lot of information very completely.
All right. Well, thanks for being on, Gail, and thanks for those that were participating today. You have Gail's contact information if you want to follow up with any other things. Otherwise, we hope to see you next Wednesday on our Heifer webinar series. So thanks and have a good day.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everybody.